Hi everyone, let's try this again. It's time for Mrs. Blue Reads. We've been reading Tumtum and Nutmeg, Adventures Beyond Nutmouse Hall. And we finished the first adventure where they were able to get rid of Aunt Lily. Boy, yeah. They got rid of the aunt and now we've got the adventure called The Great Escape. Chapter 1. And this, sorry, I gotta say, this book is by Emily Bearn, pictures by Nick Bryce, and published by Little Brown Company. Okay, now we're ready to read Chapter 1 of The Great Escape. At Nutmouse Hall, the day had begun much like any other. Nutmeg had leapt out of bed at dawn and raced downstairs to bustle and bake and clean, and Tumtum had stayed tucked up under the covers until he heard the bell ring for breakfast. He tumbled down to the kitchen, his dressing gown. "Good morning, dear," he said dozily, as Nutmeg helped him to porridge and toast and scrambled eggs and bacon and a pancake or two. "Now let's see, what shall we do today?" Tumtum always asked this, even though he knew quite well what the answer would be, for although they lived in a big, grand house, the Nutmouses led very simple lives. He has eaten his breakfast. For the most part, Nutmeg spent her days scuttling and bustling in the kitchen, preparing delicious things to eat, and Tumtum spent his days in the library, reading the Mouse Times and toasting his toes in front of the fire. So Tumtum knew what Nutmeg's answer would be. "I think I'll scuttle and bustle in the kitchen, dear," she said. "Good idea," he replied, "and I think I'll retreat to the library and toast my toes by the fire." Nutmeg approved of this plan, so they both settled down to eat, looking forward to another peaceful day at Nutmouse Hall. But just as Nutmeg was refilling the teapot, there was a loud rap-tap-tap on the front door. "I wonder who that could be?" Tumtum asked warily. Nutmeg followed him through the hall, feeling just as puzzled. The postmouse was the only person who tended to visit at this hour, but today was a Sunday. Before Tumtum had time to draw the bolts, the rap-tap-tapping started again. Then they heard a loud voice on the other side of the door. "It's General Marchmouse," announced General Marchmouse, speaking in a very General Marchmousely way. "The General," Nutmeg whispered, looking at Tumtum in astonishment. "What on earth can he want?" "I can't imagine, dear," Tumtum replied, for it was most unlike the General to visit so early. "What a nice surprise, General," he said when he opened the door. And in some ways it was, for the Nutmouses were very fond of the General, who was known to everyone as General, on account of him being rather generalish. But in other ways it wasn't, for while Tumtum and Nutmeg were very quiet mice, the General was an unusually noisy one. And today he was at his noisiest. He marched into the hall and he thumped 2 leather suitcases on the floor. "Hello," he said heartily. "Would you be so kind as to let me stay a night or two?" "Why, of course," General Tumtum stammered, feeling couldn't very well refuse. "Good," the General replied. "Mrs. Marchmouse has gone to stay with her old nanny for a week, and I was feeling lonely, racketing about the gun cupboard on my own. Now that I've retired from active service, time can hang a little heavy, you know. So I thought to myself, how jolly it would be to spend a few days with my dear friends the Nutmouses at Nutmouse Hall." Tumtum and Nutmeg both groaned inwardly. There was no hope of a quiet day now. "What's that?" Nutmeg asked, noticing that the General was carrying a fat silver pole. "That is a pogo stick," the General replied proudly. "The Royal Mouse Army's new secret weapon." "Whatever do you mean?" Tumtum asked. The General looked down his nose at him, thinking him very ill-informed. "Haven't you read the Mouse Times, Nutmouse?" he asked. "The army is being modernized. The soldiers are no longer going to ride squirrels. Oh, squirrels are old hat. From now on, the cavalry will bounce into battle on sleek silver pogo sticks, just like this. Stand back, Nutty, and I'll show you how it's done." Then the General mounted his stick and started to bounce, boing, 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 around the hall. Then he bounced, boing, 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 around the living room and the billiard room and the ballroom. And so he went on bouncing all around Nutmouse Hall, knocking into lamps and tables and stuffed cockroaches and generally making a thorough nuisance of himself. There he is. By the time he reached the kitchen, he was bouncing so high that he biffed his head on the ceiling. He sat down to breakfast, feeling quite dizzy. "We mustn't let him out of our sight for a minute," Tumtum whispered to his wife. "We don't want him giving us away." Nutmeg nodded anxiously. Any mouse visiting Nutmouse Hall had to come and go very carefully, for it was a secret house, which no human knew about. It was built in the cupboard of the Mildew's kitchen, and since the broom cupboard was hidden behind a big wooden dresser, none of the Mildews knew it was there. The Nutmouse's front gates were just behind the dresser, and they were forever creeping in and out across the Mildew's kitchen floor. But the Mildews had never seen them, because Tumtum and Nutmeg crept very quietly, and they did most of their creeping at night. At night, they crept all over the place. They crept into the pantry and into Mr. Mildew's study, and sometimes they crept up to the attic where Arthur and Lucy slept and did all sorts of helpful things. Nutmeg darned the children's clothes, tidied their satchels, and polished their shoes with a mop. Once, Tumtum had mended the wings on Arthur's model plane. And After Aunt Ivy's visit, the children and Nutmeg had continued to write each other letters, which they left on the dresser in the attic. But the children still had no idea that Nutmeg was a mouse. She had told them in one of her letters that she was a fairy, so that is what they thought she was. The Nutmouses knew that Arthur and Lucy must never learn the truth, for some humans have funny feelings about mice and think they shouldn't be allowed in the house. And imagine what the children might think if they saw the general bouncing about on a pogo stick. "We must keep him constantly entertained," Tumtum whispered to Nutmeg. "Then he might just forget about this pogoing nonsense." "What would you like to do this morning, General?" he asked joyfully, turning to his friend. "We could have a game of chess." "Later, perhaps," the general replied, dabbing scrambled egg from his whiskers. "First I shall go exploring. The room cupboard's not big enough for a mouse on a pogo stick. I want to have a bounce around the Mildew's kitchen floor and see if they've left any good pickings." This is not what Tumtum wanted to hear. "Now look here, General, I don't think that's wise," he said. "You'll only draw attention to yourself, and besides, the Mildews never leave good pickings. They eat horrible things like canned spaghetti. That's why we have our food delivered by the grocery mouse." "Well, I'd like to try canned spaghetti," the general said carelessly. "Anyway, I won't be gone for long. Just a quick breath of fresh air, and I'll be home in time for lunch." Tumtum looked stern. He did not often look stern, but when he did, he looked very stern indeed. "General, so long as you are our guest, Rose Cottage is out of bounds," he said firmly. "Now, please promise that you will not set foot outside the broom cupboard. We've 36 rooms here in Nutmouse Hall. Surely that's enough for any mouse to bounce around in." "Oh, all right then," the general said reluctantly. "I promise. I shall pogo around in here instead." As far as Tumtum was concerned, the matter was closed, for a promise is a promise, after all. But General Marchmouse found this particular promise very hard to keep. The general was a mouse who craved adventures, but since retiring from the army, he'd found them in increasingly short supply. He was starved of danger, and he had a feeling that by pogoing around Rose Cottage, he might finally find some. And yet, he was a mouse of honor, so of course he could never go back on his word. That would be out of the question. Humph! How tiresome, he thought, have to stay indoors, he thought crossly, helping himself to the last piece of bacon. He was still full of energy, so when breakfast was over, he mounted his pogo stick again and started crashing about in the ballroom. "Whoopee!" he cried as he went smack bang into a marble statue. "I'll make as much noise as possible, then Nutty will get so fed up he'll let me go." But though Tumtum could hear the racket from the library, he said nothing, which made the general even more frustrated. "Now, come on, Nutmouse. Surely it wouldn't do any harm if I went out for a few minutes," he began as they sat down to a light lunch of earwig pie. But Tumtum would not back down. "I have already made my feelings clear, and I will have no more to say on the matter." All right, the general muttered. Then he finally let the subject drop. But after lunch, when Tumtum had disappeared to the library and while Nutmeg was bustling in the kitchen, the general found himself wandering into the hall with his pogo stick tucked under his arm. He stood there a while, looking longingly at the front door. "You gave your word," the generalish side of him said, but the adventurous side said, "Go on." And so on he went. He crept out of the door, then tiptoed toward the Nutmouse's front gates. He let himself out and fumbled his way through the cobwebs underneath the dresser. Then he marched down into the kitchen, feeling a delicious thrill of adventure now that he was out of bounds. It was a foolhardy time to set out, for it was broad daylight, and someone might easily have spotted him. But the general could hear Arthur and Lucy outside playing in the garden, so he assumed he would be safe. "I'm king of the roost," he cried, bouncing gleefully across the kitchen floor. He had visited Rose's cottage several times before, and he knew exactly where he wanted to go. He bounced into the hall, then, gritting his teeth, he bounced up the stairs and onto the landing. Then he stopped suddenly, hearing something clattering in the study. He hopped across the carpet and poked his nose under the door. Inside, Mr. Mildew was sitting on the floor amid a sea of tiny wires and twisted bits of metal. He was trying to invent a mechanical frog that could be programmed to catch flies in its mouth. But like most of Mr. Mildew's inventions, it was all going wrong, and as a result, he was pounding his fists on the floor, on the floor in a hopeless rage. The general watched for a moment, then he turned around and bounced across the landing until he was standing beneath the steep flight of stairs leading to the attic. He flung his pogo stick onto the bottom step and heaved himself up after it. "I'll have all the toys to myself," he thought excitedly as he huffed and puffed his way upstairs. "I'll make castles out of building bricks and tie up the teddy bears. Oh, lucky old me!" But even the fearless General Marchmouse might have hesitated a moment had he realized just what sort of adventures were in store. Chapter 2. The general finally hoisted himself over the top step onto the attic floor. He was drenched in sweat, and the belt of his camouflage trousers was cutting into him. "You must go on a diet, Marchmouse," he muttered, searching in his pocket for a humbug. He got to his feet, crunching it noisily, but then he saw something that made him suck in his breath. He was looking straight into the barrel of a rifle. The general was so frightened he could feel his knees wobble. Standing before him was a figure in red uniform with a visor hiding his face. It wasn't the uniform of the Royal Mouse Army, and though the soldier was the size of a mouse, he didn't have a tail. "Do you know who I am?" the general demanded, trying to disguise his terror. "Well, I'll tell you. I am General Marchmouse, so there you have it." The soldier ignored him, which made the general cross. Generals are not used to being ignored. "With whose army do you serve?" the general asked briskly, but there was no reply. And that made the general even crosser. "Where is your commanding officer? I shall report you for insubordination," he shouted. He was so cross, he forgot he was frightened. But still, there was no reply. "I have killed a rat with my own bare paws," the general roared, determined to impress him. But the soldier did not respond. So General Marchmouse did something very ungeneralish. He reached forward and punched him in the stomach. But to his astonishment, the soldier just toppled over. The general blushed, feeling very foolish. For suddenly he realized that it was a toy soldier made of tin. And now looking around him, he could see dozens more of them scattered all about the floor. Some were in red uniforms and some in khaki. There were tanks, too, and piles of sandbags and grenades, and there were machine guns the size of matches. The general sucked in his breath, hardly able to believe his luck. A whole battlefield stretched before him, and everything was mouse-sized. At last he could come out of retirement and take command. Oh, how he throbbed with delight. "I'll form the men into lines and command a full-scale offensive," he thought gleefully. "We'll blow up the dollhouse." So the general spent a blissful hour ordering his new regiments. The dollhouse was placed under siege and its front door barricaded with a pencil box. The red soldiers were put inside to defend it, firing from the windows and the roof, while the khaki soldiers advanced on the building in platoons. The general commanded operations standing on top of one of Lucy's ballet shoes, shouting, "Fire!" until he was nearly hoarse. When he had hurled all the plastic grenades, he went to rummage in the toy box, looking for more missiles. He nibbled through the string of one of Lucy's necklaces and scooped the beads into his kit bag. Then he returned to his post on the ballet shoe and started lobbing them at the dollhouse, one by one. He was not a good shot, so he didn't succeed in breaking any windows, but the beads made a satisfying clunk as they smashed against the wall. When Plenty tired of that, he decided to have a go on Arthur's train set. The tracks, which had been painstakingly repaired by Tum-Tums, looped all around the floor, and every 2 feet or so they sloped up and down its steep ramps. I could get up quite a speed, he thought excitedly. He jumped on his pogo stick and hopped over a bank of sandbags toward the glistening blue carriages. Sorry, old boy, he grunted, yanking a toy soldier from the driver's compartment, but General Marchmouse is taking command. He sat on the stool and turned the big red switch to on. There was a gentle rumbling noise. Then the train slowly heaved into motion. The general whooped with delight and started grabbing wildly at the controls, trying to make it go faster. Faster, faster, he roared. But Arthur's train ran on a small battery, and however much the general punched and shoved at the knobs, it came to the same steady speed. Let's see what happens if I freewheel, he thought impatiently. The train chugged around the bedposts and up to the top of the biggest hump in the tracks, which was nearly as high as a dollhouse. The general hunched himself over the gear stick, then gingerly reached out a paw and switched off the engine. The train wobbled a moment, then it lurched forward and started whooshing downhill. The general clung to the wheels, shrieking with glee as the room sped past him in a dizzying blur. There he goes. But then he saw the hairpin bend in the track just in front of him. He grappled in panic for the brake, but the train just hurtled on faster. Help! Help! He squealed, cowering into a ball on the carriage floor, his paws pressed to his ears. He felt the train lurch violently as it hit the curve, and then the driver's compartment skidded off the rails and sailed into the air. The general fell nose down against the window and saw his tin regiment spread out below him on the floor. I'm flying! He trembled. But the worst was still to come. For the next moment, everything went black as the carriage smashed onto the roof of the dollhouse. The general lay there, too dazed to move. At first he could see nothing but stars and flashing lights. Then little by little the room came back into focus. But everything was upside down. Gradually, as he came to his senses, he realized what had happened. The carriage had landed on its side, and he was squashed tight beneath the driver's stool with all 4 paws in the air. The door was on top of him, where the ceiling should be, so it was no wonder everything looked topsy-turvy. Oh, poor me, he whimpered. What a pretty pickle! But as he was lying there, feeling as sorry for himself as any mouse can feel, he heard something that made everything much worse. Arthur and Lucy were coming up the stairs. Chapter 3. The general listened in terror as the children's voices got closer and closer. He knew he was in dreadful danger. Arthur would be astonished enough to discover that his train had been derailed. But what would he do when he found a mouse at the wheel? The general did not know Arthur as well as the Nutmouses did, and he imagined there might be terrible punishments in store. Gritting his teeth, for he was very sore, he grasped his pogo stick and used it to smash open the door above his head. Then he wriggled free of the steering wheel and pulled himself upright. Peeking outside, he saw that the carriage was stranded high on the dollhouse roof, lodged between 2 chimneys. There he is. He gripped the doorframe and hauled himself out onto the rooftop, wincing with pain. He tried to run, using his pogo stick as a crutch, but the roof was steep and he kept slipping. He floundered about desperately, but there was nowhere to hide. I'll never surrender, he vowed, and as Arthur and Lucy entered the room, he tossed his pogo stick down a chimney and dived after it head first. The children got a terrible fright when they saw the soldiers pointing their guns out of the dollhouse windows and the train lying on the roof. Lucy assumed it must have been Arthur's doing, and Arthur assumed it must have been Lucy's doing, and there were some cross words exchanged. But Arthur pointed out that it couldn't have been him, because he'd been outside all afternoon, and Lucy pointed out that it couldn't have been her, because she'd been outside all day too. So who was it? Surely not Nutmeg, for fairies didn't do things like this, and it couldn't have been their fathers, for fathers don't crash their children's trains. There must be another fairy as well as Nutmeg, Arthur said. A bad fairy who makes a mess. You know what I mean. A sort of elf. There they are, looking at the mess. The children considered this for a while. Neither of them would have believed in any sort of fairy a year ago, but since acquiring one of their own, they had become more open-minded. I wonder if Nutmeg knows, Lucy said. Do you think we should tell her? I suppose so, Arthur said. Let's leave everything as it is so she can see for herself what whoever it is has done. Imagine how surprised she'll be when she finds soldiers firing out of her dollhouse. They both considered it to be Nutmeg's dollhouse because she had redecorated it from top to bottom with new curtains and carpets and cushion covers. She'd even made a tapestry cover for the piano stool. And though they had never seen her, they suspected she sometimes spent the night there, for she kept a pair of slippers in its bedroom. So Lucy found some paper, and the children sat together on the floor and composed a letter. Dear Nutmeg, we think an elf has been in the attic while we were outside. He crashed Arthur's train and broke Lucy's necklace, and he attacked the dollhouse with tin soldiers, and he's eaten all the biscuits we left out for you. What do you think we should do? Love, Arthur and Lucy. When they had finished, Lucy folded the letter in half and left it propped against the mirror on the dresser. I hope she does something to stop it, Lucy said. So do I, Arthur agreed. He is beginning to feel quite hostile to whoever had crashed his train. While all this was going on, the general was in considerable discomfort. By a stroke of misfortune, he had dived down the living room chimney, which was the longest of all the chimneys in the dollhouse. His pogo stick had clattered down to the hearth, but he was too fat to follow, and he had gotten stuck halfway down. He wriggled and squirmed, but he couldn't budge. He was wedged upside down with his stomach squashed tight against the chimney bricks. In this undignified position, he had listened to the children's conversation, feeling crosser and crosser. An elf, he fumed, kicking his legs. I'll teach you to refer to the great General Marchmouse as an elf. But though he protested loudly, the children couldn't hear a thing, because mice have such small voices that even when they are shouting, they only make a tiny squeal. Besides, the general's shouts were muffled by the chimney. By the time the children went downstairs for lunch, the general could shout no more. He pulled in his stomach, trying to calculate how tightly he was stuck. I'll have to lose at least half an ounce before I can squeeze out of here, he thought miserably. And that would mean starving for 3 days. It was a very glum thought. And that's the end of chapter 3. So tune in next week, next Wednesday at 1 o'clock to hear what happens to General Marchmouse, who's stuck in the chimney. Tumtum Nutmeg, Adventures Beyond Nutmouse Hall. Hope you enjoyed today's chapters, today's reading. It's a beautiful day. Make sure you get outside and enjoy it. And we're supposed to have some really nice weather coming for this weekend, for Friday especially. I hope you'll get to enjoy the sunshine. I miss you lots. Hope we can see each other soon. Take care. Bye.